Hi, Deborah Overberg here again. Today we're talking about what frequency and the frequency of what, meaning what is it that is vibrating? What is it that is moving? And at what rate is it moving? What frequency? So we're going to look at it from two different perspectives. My background as electrical engineer gives me kind of the scientific definition of a frequency. And in particular, I worked with the electromagnetic frequencies, which include electricity, magnetism, and light. And these are measurable and quantifiable. And yet, my second career is with energy healers and body workers and light workers. And their definition of frequency is a little different. It's a little more colloquial. It's not so specific necessarily. It might be there is a need for a healing frequency. What's the source? There's a source frequency that comes down through the massage, the energy session, the body work. And a lot of times people then get all excited because it's so palpable. They can feel it. It's like this, it's the frequency. And it's often followed by, oh, I got goosebumps. I'm getting goosebumps. So it really sort of creates this physiological change in them. And so we're trying to look at what that is. And I often early on ask the question, well, why are they saying frequency when singular, when I see all these um, different frequencies, the frequency of the heart, the frequency of the brain, your DNA vibrates, everything's vibrating inside your body. And what I came to understand is that as a whole, our biofield, our whole energy field around us, the field of electromagnetism and everything else around us, our thoughts and emotions and connections, create a frequency. So we have a frequency that you work with somebody, you understand their frequency. You have a relationship with somebody, you get to feel their frequency. It's a sort of a compilation of everything adds up in some coherent fashion. Now, there are things besides electromagnetism that have a frequency, and one is sound. And yet, sound is different in that the what of the what frequency that is moving, that is vibrating, what is vibrating is air molecules. So they actually vibrate in somewhat of a pressure wave. They call it a longitudinal wave. Go as the air moves, the sound moves through the air. It's the air molecules that are moving. And then when we go to find out, well, how fast is that work moving? We put it through a transducer. In this case, they show a microphone, and then we see an electromagnetic signal, and that's what we record. But so one is moving air molecules, and the other is electrons that move in a different pattern. So what I want to do here is take an extreme example by using a ghost story. And ghosts and mediums work with people who have passed on onto the other side. They're not on this physical level, for the most part. And so they have what I've heard called the afterlife frequency. And we're going to make a look at that. And that's the whole consciousness of the being, again, that integrated, coherent aspect of um, living or once living being. We'll also look at emotional frequencies as part of this, and then we'll compare them and contrast them to the frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum, which might be measured and correlated. So as I said, my background, I had a microwave lab. Here's a big old honking piece of equipment I used that was old back then. And I had a lightning lab, for example. They discharged a lightning bolt just a few feet in front of me. So this first lab gave me a headache. And this other one probably aggravated my nervous system. It's a little, intense having a lightning bolt that close, that much static electricity right next to you. Um, and funny enough, this was my first exploration into alternative healing. I found out the headache that I got in microwave lab could be relieved by working an acupressure point between the thumb and the forefinger. So I understood that that could work very well. So then the frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum, this is one way they're put out. This is what I worked with. Now, they deal with quantum particles, and the quantum particles associated with the frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum are electrons and photons. And that is then what is measurable or quantifiable are things that are on this chart. So think cell phones, TV, radio, microwaves, tanning labs, X-rays and radioactivity, gamma rays, etc. So this is what I dealt with for the first part of my career. All the frequencies on this. And yet there are other quantum particles that are also have a frequency, as all quantum particles do. They all vibrate according to the wave equations. And so, for example, quarks and gluons, and these are measured at, say, CERN and various nuclear physics facilities. Neutrinos are also available. They come from the sun. They're measured at places like Fermilabs and the Ice Cube Laboratory. And then there's the Higgs boson. As far as I know, that's only measured at CERN. But the electrons and photons are measured everywhere. And with respect to our biology, as far as I know, this is the only force associated with the measurements on biological systems. Now that's starting to be changed. But for anybody working in the biofield, are using equipment based on electrons and photons. There's other postulated particles. We're not going to go there now. Some of those may or may not be validated. And so those are other frequencies. And other things that might be vibrating. And we don't really understand these as much as we'd like scientifically and are not measuring them in that same way. Spirit and soul. We might be able to do some qualitative studies about the soul and the spirit, but not quantitative. Same with prana, love, healing, quote unquote, chakras. Those are the prana and the chakras are said to be non-physical according to the Vedic traditions. And yet, like prana is considered the breath of life, and it often might get shortcut to breath and even oxygen, but it is meaning like a life force, which we really don't have that understanding for, certainly not what we'd like. So we have indirect measurements, we have correlations, but these things that are vibrating, when a chakra vibrates, it is different than a perhaps correlated endocrine reaction in the body. So on to the afterlife frequency. So here's our ghost story. So what happened to me one time is on this frequency, what it means to me is all of our, for better or worse, our relatives, our friends, family, others who have crossed on. It's the vibration that they have, that totality we're talking about, the sort of their whole coherent consciousness. And some might come to visit to let us know that they're okay, and that all is well and not to worry. And some are a little different. So I had an experience with creepy guy in number 9. So this was my office building, and the building was being sold. So it had a whole bunch of different offices all across in the upper level. And I was in one end of the hall, and suddenly in room number 9 at the other end of the hall, I kind of had a sense of a creepy guy, hanging out there. And obviously there was nobody there. And a friend comes up to visit. She says, "Hey, Deb, how's it going?" Looks over, who's that creepy guy in number 9? Okay, well, why don't you, that's what I want to know. Who is that guy? So we had a chance to sit down, and my friend was psychic and talk to them like many mediums do these days. And it turns out, like anybody else, they're a decent guy once you get to know him. He, though, had a very difficult childhood and grew up in an orphanage, and there was no love in that orphanage. Later, he rode the railroad. This was a railroad town I was in, mines all around. And so it was a hobo. And as a hobo, he did have sort of a camaraderie with the other hobos, but he didn't have that real deeper love connection in his life. And what happened is he came from the other building next door, different ghost story. We were not going to go there, and came over to room number 9 because he saw what was happening in my office space on the healings that were going on and what was taking place. Well, to make a long story short, a couple days later, he comes in, or somebody comes into my office, a client comes in and starts talking about an orphanage. And in this orphanage, this lady volunteered and she found out she was reading them bedtime stories and realized they don't change their clothes at night. They wear the same clothes. They didn't have any pajamas. Like, who knew? So she went out. She felt sorry for all these kids who were sleeping in the same clothes they had lived in and went out and bought them all pajamas. And it was so heartwarming. And the way this person told it was so heartwarming. And we were just practically in tears there. And at the other end of the hall, out in room number 9, I sort of sensed this bright light that's happening as this decent guy kind of transitions and moves on, and he was able to accept it. So that's my ghost story. Now, correlations, I didn't know this was available. Maybe it wasn't at the time, but there are correlations, the afterlife, that are measured with electromagnetic equipment. This one I like because it's called the ghost meter, it says right on it. And so when the decent guy showed up in number 9, it would read, for example, 4 milligauss. And when he left, when he wasn't there, it would read 0 and back and forth. So that they do measure that electricity, magnetism, and light. And yet the frequency to heal, what got him to move on, was what I'm calling this tender loving, pajamas story. I don't see that on my chart, on our chart of electromagnetism. And in my years of working, decades working with the test equipment, I never found tender loving pajamas on this chart. I think it belongs on a different chart. So you can go to the internet, and this is just one chart that I pulled off, this emotional frequency chart. I suggest that that tender loving emotional thing that allowed him to pass on, to cross over, is on this chart, where we see contentment, um, helpfulness, passion, love, joy. So somewhere on that upper spiral of this chart is the emotions that we felt. And perhaps it even needed that extra oomph of being related to an orphan that he was, or maybe it just wasn't any tender loving thing. It was something that was relative to him as an orphan and showing this act of kindness to an orphan. So I call this more like a vibe that's more vague, but that's more personal to me because my mind here's frequency and I go to the electromagnetic spectrum, even though on second thought, I know it can refer to lots of things, vibrate. So we've got these 3 different charts describing 3 different types of frequencies. One, that afterlife frequency that could actually be called the light frequency, is the whole person, sort of that whole vibe about the person and their biofield. The emotional frequencies are those that we discussed of more positive or negative emotional frequencies that we're feeling at any particular time. And those can be a healing frequency sometimes, particularly if they're put in a context that makes sense to the person. And then we have the frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum. And that is when it is in the physical body, able to be measured and detected, quantifiable. And so really all these three charts, in our being all go together and are all entwined. And you can even say they're quantum entangled. And we will be talking and have talked about quantum biology and that entanglement, but that gets complicated, and we're just leaving it real simple for right now. And the question then becomes, here's what I want to know is how do you bring all those good vibes, that higher consciousness states, the real positive attributes that we want in our life, that we know is good for us, that we know heals us, and how do we bring it into manifestation in all of our physical body, bones, heart, brain, etc. And so that is the next question. That's what I want to know. Thank you.